Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 63. I have Annie Kallen, who is from Oregon and is going to talk about star voting. She is with Equal Vote, and she's going to talk about election reform and, above all, star voting. How are you, Annie?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Okay, so first of all, tell me, how did you get into all this?
Well, I first heard about ranked choice voting before I learned about other voting methods, and that was something that intrigued me. This was several years ago, and it was sold as this idea that with ranked choice voting, you could vote your conscience, and if your favorite didn't win, then your vote would go to your next favorite. And so I was excited about that. I wanted to get involved in that. And I actually happened across a star voting petition, which is a different voting method, but it's got the same idea. And so I just kind of went down the rabbit hole and started learning about voting methods and what's the difference between them. And I learned that ranked choice voting actually doesn't do everything that it says that it will do. Your vote doesn't always go to your next choice if your favorite doesn't win and things like that. So star voting excited me because it actually achieves a lot of these things that are the goals of voting method reform. And, you know, as someone who has never felt like I can really vote my conscience in elections, you know, usually the red and the blue candidates, not only do they not excite me, usually I'm very much, you know, turned off by them, but I have voted lesser evil in the past, and I don't like doing that. So we can actually change the system to make it so that we don't have to do that lesser evil voting.
Yeah, so you went from ranked choice voting to star voting, and that sounds like it's a natural progression. Can you tell us exactly, for people who've never heard of this, what is star voting?
Yeah, so with star voting, you score the candidates on a scale of 0 to 5. You do them all independently of each other. So if you want to give the same scores to multiple candidates, that's fine. And then you add up all of the scores. The two highest scoring candidates are finalists, and then whichever finalist was preferred by the most voters wins. And so you only vote once, but it's counted in 2 rounds. The first round, you're adding up the scores. The second round, you're adding up the votes. So it's actually very simple compared to ranked choice voting, but it achieves more accurate results.
Yes, and you can. So, for example, you could give 5 stars to all 5 candidates, or you could give 1 star to all 5 candidates, or you could go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Right, you could do that. It's advisable that if you have a preference between candidates, that you express that preference. But if you really don't see a difference, if you think they're all great or you think they're all terrible, then you can mark your ballot that way if you want.
Yeah, so it does give people more options. And this is really a lot like what people are doing nowadays, because it's a lot like, Yelp ratings or something like that. You rate these things with 5 stars or 1 star. So this is something that I think people would be very comfortable with.
Yeah, the actual ballot completion stage is very familiar. Everybody knows how to score things on a scale of 0 to 5. Yeah. Of course, the tabulation is done differently than how, like, Amazon or something, what they do with the data is different. But from the perspective of the person filling out the ballot, it's going to be really familiar.
Yeah. Well, Amazon does do 10 stars, and some other sites do 10 stars.
Yeah.
Wait, no, Amazon does do 5 stars. IMDb does 10 stars, but
okay.
Most of them do 5 stars. That seems to be what people are.
Yeah, it's kind of a natural number, and what we've discovered in our analysis is that it's a really good number because it's enough expressiveness that you can show a lot of nuance, but it's not so much expressiveness that you become overwhelmed. So I think there's a reason why a lot of systems settle on that, is because it's kind of a nice middle ground there.
And it's the number of fingers you have on your hand. So
that too.
Which I think is why 5 has gotten so important. But
yeah.
But yes, so you end up with so what do you think are some of the benefits of ranked choice or of star voting over ranked choice voting or other voting systems?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different reasons. I already touched on the fact that with ranked choice voting, your favorite might get eliminated, but your vote might still not transfer to your next choice, which is something that's a little counterintuitive. I won't go into it here because it's easier when you have a visual. And by the way, there's lots of videos on the Equal Vote channel. We've got a playlist of videos that we've collected from all around the internet and some that we've made ourselves that can kind of go through these things a little bit more visually. And also starvoting.org is a great resource for those visuals. But so that's one problem, is that your vote might not transfer to your second choice with ranked choice voting. And it also continues to have vote splitting. So because you're only looking at one ranking at a time, you can have vote splitting in every round. And voters are actually incentivized to rank their lesser evil first if they think that it's not going to go past the first round. So it suffers from a lot of the same kinds of problems as our current voting method. And on the other hand, star voting, you're counting all of that ballot data at once. And so you don't have that same risk of vote splitting because you're looking at all of the voters, how they feel about all of the candidates at the same time, and using simple addition to determine what are the top two finalists.
Certainly, and also you can still count the ballots at the site. I mean, you don't have that with ranked choice voting. All the counts have to be centralized.
Right. Yeah, and that's a huge issue for me. And I think most libertarians would agree that the ranked choice voting requires centralized tabulation. So, for example, here in Oregon, there was a ranked choice voting bill it's passed in the House. It's gone to our state Senate. Our state Senate right now is kind of in a mess, so it may not go any further. But this bill specifically states that the tabulation would be taken away from the county clerks and given to the Secretary of State. So it's so inherent to ranked choice voting that they actually had to write it into the bill. And that's a huge problem for me. I have concerns about the security, the transparency of a system like that. And we've seen it in real elections. So, for example, in New York, when they had a ranked choice voting election, there was an error where a whole bunch of test ballots were accidentally added to the count in the actual election, and the elections board didn't catch that it had happened. And so those kinds of errors are more likely to happen because of the complexity, and they're less likely to be caught because of that lack of transparency and the centralized nature of it. So, and I won't even go into Alameda County, which had its also had tabulation errors that were not caught by the board of the election board. But you wouldn't have that problem with star voting, because with star voting you can still tabulate the ballots. You can run them through the machines at the county level. You can do the math at the county level, and then you send the subtotals to that central location, and the subtotals are totaled to get your result. So that's that's because of the fact that star voting uses addition as its math. Yeah. And so you can do it separately.
Alameda County, that was in what state?
That's in California.
Okay.
And what happened there was like somebody didn't hit the right button in the software or something, and there was just a little slight tabulation. It was tabulating things a little bit differently than it should have. Like I think it had something to do with when people gave two candidates the same ranking, they had some sort of fix to work around that or something like that. And somebody didn't hit the right button in the software, and so it was tabulating those wrong. And it did that in every election during that period. And one of the candidates that was signed in, sworn in, was actually the wrong winner. So that has to be resolved in the court system because they actually, I can't remember the word, but they,
Yes.
brought in the wrong candidate all the way through that process before a third party caught the error, and then they had to figure out how they were going to resolve that.
It seems like there's also maybe more potential for confusion with ranked choice voting. Do you think that's a problem or not?
Yeah, I would say so. And again, that has to do with the complexity of it and the fact that it doesn't use addition. You can't give two candidates the same ranking in ranked choice voting. If you do that, there's a chance that your ballot will be spoiled, which means it won't be counted. There, you can sometimes have workarounds, like I was talking about, but it depends on the circumstance. So there's a lot of extra complexity. There's more strategy that you have to think about. You have to think about, okay, who are the front runners? Am I afraid that my favorite candidate is going to spoil the election? Just like with our current voting method of choose one only voting, you have to take those things into consideration because of that spoiler effect that still exists. But it's harder to see what's going on, and it's harder to understand when things go wrong. So as an example, in Alaska, there was a special election that had Sarah Palin, Nick Begich, and Mary Peltola running. And Peltola ended up winning. She's the progressive candidate. Palin was the sort of kind of Trump supporter type conservative candidate. She and Peltola were the ones that made it into the final round. So a lot of people think, oh, Palin should have won because it was, the majority of the voters were more conservative leaning. So they think that ranked choice voting failed and Palin should have won. And the thing with that situation is the voters, the people that are criticizing ranked choice voting, they're right that ranked choice voting picked the wrong winner in that situation. But they're wrong about why. It's not that Palin should have won, it's that Begich should have won. He was the candidate that was preferred head-to-head over all of the other candidates, but he actually got eliminated before that final round, and so all of his down-ballot support, his second, third, all of that extra data was never counted, and it turns out he had a lot of second choice support from voters. So that's where it can get confusing. People can understand, like, I don't think this worked out right. This doesn't feel right. This doesn't seem like it's the right winner. But a lot of times people don't understand why that's the case. Yeah. So a lot of people think that Palin should have won that election, and they're part right. They're right that Peltola wasn't the candidate preferred head-to-head over the other candidates. But what a lot of people fail to understand is that it wasn't Palin's race to win. It was actually Begich. He was eliminated early, but he was actually the candidate which was preferred head-to-head over the other two. So ranked choice voting can fail to elect the right winner, but it also makes it hard for people to understand why it did that and what actually should have happened, because it doesn't display the results in a way that are easy for people to understand.
Yeah, definitely. So where has star voting been implemented so far?
So it hasn't been implemented for municipal use yet. For political use, it was used by the Independent Party of Oregon primary election in 2020, and it also has been used by the Democratic Party of Oregon for presidential delegate selection. And then there's a few other parties that are using it for internal election, including the Libertarian Party of Oregon authorized its use and are planning to use it for our next election. So a lot of places in Oregon, a lot of parties and nonprofits in Oregon have started using it. And we're looking to get it on the ballot in a couple places here in Oregon. So hopefully it will have municipal use very soon.
I know the sports awards have something like star voting where you'll have, like, for example, if you're voting for the MVP, although you'll have a first place vote, a second place vote, and a third place vote. So So that's one way they use this form of star voting, but just it's based on the points, and sometimes the person who ends up second is the person who has the most second place votes, and the person who ends up third is the person who has the most third place votes. But the person who wins obviously has the most first place votes. But
Yeah, and I'm not
that
familiar enough with that to be able to comment
yeah
on that.
yeah
But yeah,
it's
there's a lot
been
of
yeah
different
that's been
methods
for a
out
long
there.
time. Yeah, what are some other voting systems that you'd like to contrast and compare this with? I mean, I know there's approval voting and some other
Yeah, I'd
systems.
say the big three in the U.S. that have movements are ranked choice voting, star voting, and approval voting. Approval voting is really nice because it's extremely simple. So whenever people are concerned about complexity, I recommend approval voting to them. It's so easy. You don't even have to change the way the ballot looks. All you do is you take away the restriction that says mark only one, and you tell people mark all of the candidates that you approve of. And it's hard to believe, but that actually does a better job than ranked choice voting at picking the candidate that the voters wanted. So it's much, much simpler, but actually does a better job, which is, pretty astonishing. And it's being used in Fargo, North Dakota, and in St. Louis, Missouri. And there's a movement around the country to get it in different places. I know Utah has is kind of a stronghold of that movement. So yeah, I find approval voting a very exciting option as well, especially for people who want that simplicity. And then there's there's a million other voting methods too. I won't go into all of them, but if you want to go down the rabbit hole, then you can learn a lot.
But obviously, you think star voting is better than approval voting.
I prefer star voting. It's slightly more accurate when you run simulations, especially if you compare it. So when you have approval voting with a runoff vote, it becomes really accurate. But if you don't have that runoff vote, then it's not quite as good as star voting. But for me, I think one of the big advantages of star voting is actually just that people can sense and feel and understand that it's more expressive than what we do now.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with approval voting, I think people have a hard time understanding how much better it is. So it actually it's unfortunate. It's kind of a catch-22, but its simplicity, I think, sometimes makes people think, oh, that's not good enough, when in fact it actually is really good. But yeah, star voting is the one that I don't know. It makes the most sense, I think, for Oregon, and it's something that I've used it before, and it just feels like something that it strikes that balance really well about all the different things that you want in a voting method.
Is there a need for runoffs with star voting, or do you think star voting ends up giving you the candidate that's really has the most approval?
Yeah, and the whole idea of runoffs was originally invented to deal with this whole problem of vote splitting. That's why we often will have an election in May, and then the top two go to November, and then we vote again. That whole system was invented because people understood that vote splitting was ruining the election. So that's the nice thing about star voting, is that you can eliminate the primary if you want and just vote once in the general, and you'll get really accurate results. It saves a lot of money. You don't have to print all those extra ballots, and and people are more likely to vote in the general as well, so you get more representativeness. If you want to keep the primary, you can. Some people like to have it just to whittle down the candidates, but you don't have to.
Yeah, and you end up also with you also end up with people voting twice. I mean, one of the drawbacks with a lot of the just the winner, whoever wins, of course, is you end up with a candidate who maybe you've got 10 candidates and your winner has 27% of the vote for you. So you ended up with 73% of the people didn't want that guy.
Yes,
so
exactly.
They want that winner, and that certainly creates a problem. So
that's exactly the problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah.
And the other problem with a primary is that it creates this really long campaign season, which means that if you don't have money, it's really hard to campaign, because you have to do it once in May, and then you have to do it all summer and then, another push right before November. And that's tough to do if you have a job or kids or don't have a lot of resources. So if you can just bring it to one election, that opens up options for more people.
I don't remember it that way. And sometimes I wonder if it's due to all this, the proliferation of the 24-hour news cycle and all this other media that we have. I mean, you've got to fill time. I mean, and, I remember when you had 12 TV stations on the TV, and you had a few newscasts. There just wasn't time to talk about the presidential election, and unless the presidential election was imminent.
Right. Yeah, I miss the days before the 24-hour news cycle. That's for sure.
Yeah, I don't know if that's part of it too, but one thing we've noticed though too, and we've talked about it seems like, obviously, it seems like more voters are there voting against something than they're voting for something. I remember in a discussion there was a 2010 governor primary in Texas, and there was Kay Bailey Hutchison, Rick Perry, and Deborah Medina. And somebody said, well, if it was Hutchison versus Medina, I would vote for Medina. If it was Perry versus Medina, I would vote for Medina. But because it's all three, I'm voting for Perry because I don't want Hutchison. And I'm just thinking, why did it, and there is a runoff. So it's like, why are you doing this? It's, I didn't, I just, I don't know if we can ever really change that whole mentality. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think in a certain way people are kind of hardwired for tribalism, which can lead to some of that negativity. But a lot of it really does come down to the voting method. So, and you're right that the runoff, it should mean that people vote their conscience in the primary, but maybe they don't quite understand how the runoff works. But certainly in the general election, or like, when you're voting for president, there's a disincentive for candidates to campaign positively, because with our choose one only voting method, it's only accurate when there are two candidates in the race. So it's going to naturally whittle down to two front runners. And the best way that you can win a race like that against one other person is to, claim that they're the devil. And so that's going to be their tactic, and that's going to be the winning tactic. And so that's what they tend to do. Whereas if you have an election where you have 5 or 10 candidates who all actually have a chance to win because the voting method is good, then there's an incentive for people to work together to say, hey, you and I are ideologically similar. Let's campaign together. Let's encourage people to give both of us 5 stars, or, things like that. So there's also an incentive to reach out across the aisle to people who maybe you wouldn't normally reach out to as a candidate. So, a left-leaning candidate, there's an incentive to reach out to the right-leaning candidates and say, hey, I know you're not going to make me your 5-star vote, but maybe you could, give me 1 or 2 stars or 3 stars, and I'm going to convince you why you should do that. And, vice versa. The right candidates can do that to the left, the middle can do it to everybody. It just encourages people to reach out to all of the voters and not tribalize everybody. It's actually built into the system why we do that. So the choose one only voting method incentivizes polarization and negative campaigning, because it naturally whittles down to 2 front runners. And so the most advisable strategy for a candidate in that situation is to make the other candidate look like the devil so that they can win, because fear is a very motivating factor. But if you have a system that allows many candidates to run, you might have, 5, 10 candidates, and they all actually have a shot at winning, then there's an incentive for them to, with star voting, they could reach out to other candidates that are ideologically similar. They could campaign together. They could say, give us both 5 stars, or they might say, hey, give me 5 stars, but my friend here is pretty great too. Maybe give them 4 stars. And you would also be incentivized to reach out to voters who, in our current voting method, you might not reach out to them because they're, air quotes, the enemy, or they're voting for the other guy. But with star voting, you can reach out to them and encourage them to say, hey, I know I'm not your favorite, but I'm going to try to convince you why you should give me 2 stars or 3 stars, and just try to push up your support broadly and not just strongly with a small core of supporters. So the mechanics of the voting method actually affect whether the campaign is negative or positive.
Certainly, that's good to know. So, yeah, the whole negative. Yeah, it seems like people just take a very negative approach to voting. I don't know if we can change that. Yeah, what other reforms would you like to see with voting today besides star voting? Are there any other reforms or any other things that you think might work?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people are agreed that gerrymandering is a problem. I will say that if you have a better voting method like star voting in place, then the problems with gerrymandering become a lot less prominent. But that is probably something that we can work on simultaneously. I think just in general, security and transparency is one of my big concerns, and so that's partially built into the voting method, but it's also partially has to do with the factors completely separate from the voting method. So that's something that I think is really important, and that's really a bipartisan thing. Right now it's conservatives that tend to be concerned about that, but that's really everybody's concern if your voting method isn't secure and transparent. And I think another big one that people talk about a lot is proportional representation, which can make it easier for more parties to be represented in multi-seat bodies like a legislature. So there's a lot of complexity to that. That could be a whole podcast just by itself. But that's kind of an interesting option.
Well, I definitely wonder, about the whole aspect of having voting districts, because your geography doesn't necessarily influence your vote. I mean,
Right.
as a libertarian, I have more in Texas. I have more in common with a libertarian in Minnesota than I do with some of my neighbors.
Right. Yeah, I think geography does play a factor, because there's going to be, wealth disparity between different districts. There's going to be, sometimes cultural differences or racial differences, but it's not the only way that you can divide up an electorate to assign seats. It's one tool in a toolkit, but it's not the only one.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and one reform I would definitely like to see is all elections are on election day, nothing else.
Yeah. I think that would be good.
Yeah, I mean,
it would be cheaper too.
The first Tuesday. Well, that's also what people are just getting used to. It's people are creatures of habit. You're used to, it's the first Tuesday in November. That's usually election day.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would.
Yeah, actually, the way it works out, it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday, which is why the first is never election day, but the 8th is election day. But it's always the 2nd through the 8th.
And interesting.
People get used to that, yes. So I suppose maybe it's because I would guess that maybe because of All Saints Day is why they didn't want to do that. But I don't know
that could be, yeah.
But I do find that interesting. It's either the 2nd through the 8th that election day is.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so you end up with, and and obviously, I mean, you're probably pretty much in favor of electronic voting, or what do you think about vote by mail and some of this other stuff that's going on?
Yeah, I'm a little bit torn on vote by mail. I think in some ways it's really great. I'm in a vote by mail state. In fact, I think Oregon might have been the first. And I love that I can get my ballot in the mail. I can take my time. I can crack it open. I can have my laptop open. I can do some research, eat a bagel or, whatever. So it's really convenient, and I really enjoy it for that. I going back to the security concerns, I do have some security concerns. I've known people who say, I got 2 ballots in the mail just for me, or, my dead father keeps getting ballots in the mail and things like that. So I am concerned about that. I think we could resolve that concern if we had really great auditing in place. I don't think that we do right now in Oregon. So for me, vote by mail is an option, but you really want to be pairing that with some really great auditing to make sure that there's not fraud happening.
Yeah. And I mean, certainly, I don't, what you have to say about paper ballots versus some of these more electronic systems. I mean,
I think paper ballots are the way to go. It's just a lot harder to commit fraud or to fake an election when you have paper ballots. An electronic system, it's really difficult to audit, and they, people who run these systems love to say, oh no, it's we've confirmed there's no problems. And it's like, well, how did you confirm it? By, doing some kind of software test. And it's like, okay, well, how do we know that software is right? It's just, there's so many layers of obscurity with that I'd really much rather see paper ballots. That being said, there are controls you can put in place to make electronic voting, a little bit more secure, and in some cases, it's a good option if you don't have the money to run a larger scale election. So, like a political party that's small might choose to do electronic voting, as long as they put the security in place, and it'll probably be fine. But for large scale elections, I think paper is the way to go.
Certainly. Do you think there's more fraud and abuse in smaller elections or in bigger elections, or if there is fraud and abuse? I mean,
that's a good question. I would, I'm just guessing here, but I would think in larger elections it's going to be more likely to happen because it's harder to notice. Things can get lost in the largeness of it.
Yeah. What do you and what do you it seems like, also, I don't know how long you've been around this, but does it seem like it's getting more difficult to vote? I mean, I hear these stories, I had to wait 2 hours to vote. I had to wait 3 hours to vote and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, and I have to say, because I am voting by mail, that's not something that I've had to deal with for a long time, since I lived in Arizona. So it's not something I've personally experienced. I know there were a lot of challenges when people were, restricted from leaving their homes during the pandemic, and they had really long lines during that time period. But yeah, from my personal experience, it's not something that's really applied to me for a while, which, it's another benefit of vote by mail. As long as you can, have that auditing to make it secure.
True. And one thing I can tell you also is it used to be a lot of the poll workers were mostly housewives. Since we don't have a lot of housewives, I think a lot of times it's mostly retirees now. And I know my mother was a poll worker, and that seemed to become a problem too. It was harder to get people to work the polls. So
that's an interesting point. Yeah, as more people are in the workplace, then you have less people to do these kinds of volunteer type tasks. I never thought about that.
Yeah, and another benefit too, of small precincts is you end up, in a situation where everybody knows everybody. So,
yeah.
I mean, I don't think my mother ever asked anybody for ID to vote.
Interesting.
It's like, oh yeah, I know you. Yeah, sure. Yeah, come on in.
Yeah, that's kind of a benefit of communities of all kinds. When you know your neighbor, when you
Yeah.
know the people that live on your street, it
Yeah.
creates a whole host of benefits.
Yes, it does. So, what do you think about some other things? I mean, you talked about primaries. What do you think about top two?
So top two is an improvement over not having top two, but it's it doesn't go far enough. Um, it's it whittles down your candidates to two, so that when you vote in the general, you don't have vote splitting in the general. But the problem is you still have vote splitting in the primary, and so you don't know if those top two that went to the general are actually the top two. So it's better than not doing anything at all, but it has its own problems.
I think you're probably more likely to get a voter because everybody's able to vote for everybody. Sometimes you'll hear about where somebody will go in and try to. I don't like this party, so I'll vote for the worst candidate I can possibly vote for to make them look bad in the general election and stuff like that. I mean,
Yeah.
Top two solves that problem. And I think it is more likely that somebody you get in with somebody there that somebody wants it, and it would possibly cut down on the election season. I don't, because I think yeah.
What would cut down on the election season?
Election season if you had top two, but I've heard arguments for and against. Some people say it doesn't really improve the situation all that much, but
yeah, I'm not sure if it does in that regard.
Yeah. So, what else? What else have you observed in your activism with equal vote?
Yeah, I mean, I think
the
the main thing that I've observed is that people are really hungry for change. So, we've got this Start Voting for Oregon ballot initiative that we're collecting signatures for now, right now. So I went to a parade. We have a Rose Festival parade every year here in Portland. So it's a great opportunity to collect signatures because people are sitting around waiting for the parade, and they're almost happy to have somebody interrupt their boredom. So a lot of the people that I talked to were just excited that there are solutions, because most people don't know that there are solutions. They just think that our politics stinks and that's just how it is, and it's always going to stink, and we're always going to have two terrible people to choose between. And so I think there's kind of a light bulb moment where people realize, like, oh, there is hope here. We don't have to be stuck with what we're stuck with. We don't have to have this hyperpolarization. We can actually have reasonableness in our politics. And so I think that's for me the most fun, is talking to people and seeing that light bulb go on, where they realize that there's positivity. It's a very positive movement for the most part. You don't have to live with what we've been living with. We actually can make a change, and that's very exciting.
Yeah, maybe it will give people a different mindset, when the voters a different mindset when they go in to vote.
Yeah, I hope so.
But I've heard, I've been hearing these polls for so many years. People want third choices, but then it's like, well, if you want third choices, either vote for them, give them money, or volunteer for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like
that's part of it. But I think the biggest piece is really just getting a voting method that won't have vote splitting, because people are pragmatic. They go into the election and they say, oh, I really like Gary Johnson, I really like Joe Jorgensen, but I'm terrified that fill in the blank is going to win, so I'm going to vote for the other guy, or whatever. So we have a tendency to blame voters. I live in Portland, and so a lot of people will say, whenever Portlanders complain about the state of Portland, people say, well, you voted for this, so you have to live with it. And the fact of the matter is, most of us didn't vote for this, but we're still stuck with it. And so I think it's unfair to blame voters when the system is rigged against them.
Yeah. And, in other ways too, we have ballot access laws and things like that seem to make things harder.
Yeah. yeah, there's all sorts of ways that the two parties, the two major parties, try to maintain their stranglehold. The voting method
Yeah,
is one, ballot access is another. Things like debate stage, keeping people off the debate stage, that's another way that they do it. But
yes.
I have to say, and I hate to always bring this back to the voting method, but it's usually related. And in this case, the big two parties, part of the reason why they're afraid to let libertarians or other third parties on the debate stage is because they're terrified of that vote splitting. So conservatives in particular are often motivated to get rid of libertarians as much as possible so that they don't have that competition. And so if you had a fair voting method, then some of these other problems might evaporate a little bit. They'll still be there, but they may not be as bad.
Yeah, I wonder also too if somebody's ever thought about applying this to a convention election, because we've had there have been some long conventions in the past.
Yeah, and I'm not totally familiar with how the Libertarian Party does things now, but I'm pretty sure they use some form of ranked choice voting for the presidential candidates, I think.
No, you just keep doing ballots until somebody gets a majority.
Okay.
Yeah, it
I
keeps.
guess that's
But
not
every
ranked
but every
choice, but
time you
it's
do
similar.
it, but the first ballot, after the first ballot, the top 5 are taken, and then after that, what then the fifth candidates drop, the fourth candidates drop, the
I
third
see.
candidate dropped until you get a majority.
Okay.
One of the more interesting convention stories is the Blue Team's convention back in 1924, which went to 103 ballots, but it was also interesting because they actually required a 2/3 majority to nominate the candidate.
Okay.
That went to John W. Davis, but it went to 103 ballots. Obviously, it wasn't just the majority; it was 2/3. It was.
So you're saying
I think
there was 103 ballot difference?
they voted 103 times.
Oh wow. Wow. Yeah, that would get tiring. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's it's an okay way to do things mathematically, but you have to take into account that we're human, and so having a system that's easy to use is also really important.
Yeah, yeah. And what ends up in a situation like that too is you often end up with the candidate who doesn't really the candidate who has the least haters.
Yes.
Because we went into some libertarian conventions, and you have these some people. Well, I'm never Smith, I'm never Jones, I'm never Miller, I'm never Anderson, that kind of thing.
Right.
And so you have these, and the candidate who often has the least nevers is who gets it.
Right.
Although that candidate may not necessarily be the. Yeah, it's very very interesting how that works. It's just
Well, and that's why we tend to call it lesser evil voting. And
yeah. Mm-hmm.
like people like to say, a vote for lesser evil is still a vote for evil. but
Oh yes. Mm-hmm.
but when you're in a bind, that's what a lot of people are going to do.
Yeah, it's a very interesting story. Any any what do you who are some of the big supporters of star voting right now? Who's getting behind it?
Yeah, so I am the president of the Equal Vote Coalition, which is the primary organization that advocates for star voting. Apart from that, like I said, there's nonprofits and political parties that are using it, primarily in Oregon, but we also have volunteer teams all over the country. We've got some big ones in New York and California and Massachusetts that are working on star voting initiatives. And we have some other nonprofits that are working on different reforms, but that are in alignment. Like the Center for Election Science has really great information on voting methods. If you're looking for something that's really accurate, you can look at their website. So yeah, just a lot of support in Oregon currently, but we're reaching our tendrils out and trying to get this anywhere that there's an opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. And sounds like a lot of the people who came to start voting were formerly advocates of ranked choice voting.
Yeah, the vast majority of people that you talk to who are star voting advocates, most of them have a similar story, which is that they were first excited about ranked choice voting, and then they dug into it a little bit more, and they learned some things, and they realized it doesn't actually do the things that it claims to do. For me, one of the biggest problems with ranked choice voting is that it doesn't actually give third parties more of a chance to win. And we know this is true because when you look at the Australian House, which uses single winner ranked choice voting, and they continue to have a two-party system after 100 years. So if you need any real world evidence that it doesn't actually help third parties, it's right there, and it's also in the math. So it's very consistent in telling us over and over again it's actually not better than our current voting method, and in some ways it's actually worse. So it's kind of a journey that you take if you're a curious person, if you have the time and the interest enough to go digging. There's a path from ranked choice voting to star voting that's a little different for everybody, but still a very common story.
Yeah, certainly. So where do you think star voting is going to go from here? Do you think maybe you'll convince more people away from ranked choice voting to star voting, or?
Yeah, I think so. And that's a big part of our work at Equal Vote is to provide education and to try to take some of these complex subjects and simplify them. So that's a big part of our mandate as an organization. And the other way one of the big ways to do that is to get people using it. So, we encourage people to go to star.vote. You can create a free, easy to use poll, star voting poll. You can use it for if you're trying to decide where to go hiking this weekend, or you're trying to decide what kind of meal you want to eat with your friends, any kind of decision you want to make. If there's more than two choices, you can pull up this poll and everybody can vote on it. And then you can see how it works, and hopefully people will be comfortable with that enough to want to bring it to their own legislatures, to their cities, to their elections. I had something else I was going to say, but I lost it. You asked where star voting is going. So yeah, right now we're really focused on the Star Voting for Oregon ballot initiative, and hopefully it gets adopted here. And then if it does, then that'll be big news that hopefully other places around the country and around the world will take an interest.
Yeah. Yeah. So does it seem like you get more support for this among other third parties, or besides the two so-called major parties?
Actually, I would say that's a tough question to answer. I think a lot of the volunteers tend to be either independents or from third parties, but we actually do get a fair amount of support from people in the major parties because they also are interested in not having vote splitting anymore. For third parties, the reason why we want to not have vote splitting anymore is so that we can have a chance to win. For the major parties, why they don't want to have vote splitting anymore is because it might ruin their chance to win if a third party comes in and splits the vote. And so it actually kind of benefits everybody. As long as you're running a good campaign, the voting method shouldn't trip you up. And so it's something that really everybody can get behind regardless of where you fall.
Most certainly. Yeah. So so this star voting's been around what, about 10 years, or?
It was invented in 2014, so almost 10 years. It was invented at a meeting there was a conference by the Equal Vote Coalition. This was before I got involved, where they brought all sorts of different voting method reform advocates together, had a conference, and out of that conference, there were some interesting conversations that have happened. And somebody suggested, what if we use this score ballot, but then had an instant runoff, kind of combining the best of scoring and ranking systems. And at first there was skepticism, which you should expect out of these kinds of analytical people. But they started to do the math and they ran some simulations and they realized actually this works really well. You can combine the best of scored methods and ranked methods and come out with something that's better than either. So that's why Oregon is kind of the stronghold of star voting. It was invented here, and we're excited to bring it to the world.
Certainly, it sounds an exciting time to bring it to the world.
Yeah,
What do you think
very
are
much
be some
needed.
of the obstacles that you hear? What are some of the obstacles you hear, and what are some of the criticisms you hear from potential allies or people you talk to about this?
I think one of the biggest obstacles we're facing right now is that there's currently a huge backlash against ranked choice voting, and rightly so. But people don't really necessarily make the distinction between ranked choice voting and other alternative voting methods. And so they find out that, oh, ranked choice voting actually has all these problems. It's being oversold. It has vote splitting. It elected the wrong candidate. It's confusing. And so then there's this big anti-ranked choice voting push. It's been banned in a whole bunch of states. It's been repealed in a lot of different places. Utah just repealed it in a lot of cities. There's a movement to repeal it in Alaska, and they only just got it. So that kind of negativity against voting method reform, unfortunately, has some kind of overflow effect, and so people, if they're skeptical of ranked choice voting, they tend to be skeptical of star voting too. And so it's unfortunate that we're getting caught up in that crossfire. It's kind of the biggest challenge we're facing right now is to provide accurate, good information about ranked choice voting is terrible. Here's why, and here's why star voting doesn't have those same problems.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe this will be a good time to, I don't know. Maybe you can work on more ranked choice voting advocates and see if they might want to come over to this. Although sometimes when people have invested a lot of time in something, they don't want to give up and go to
Yeah,
something else.
there's definitely a sunk cost fallacy that gets involved there, and people want to save face, if they've been saying something's great for 20 years and then they find out that it's not, there's a cognitive dissonance there, and so people tend to I think emotionally
Oh yeah,
push back on that. They don't
yeah,
want to go down that route even in their
yeah,
own minds, and so
yeah.
it's a part of human nature, and obviously not everybody's like that, but there's a certain percentage of people who are in that boat. But it's not a hopeless cause. Like I said, most of us started out as ranked choice voting supporters,
Yeah.
and we were able to make the transition. So
Well,
I do think it's possible, and a lot of times people who are campaigning for ranked choice voting, they'll say privately, "Oh, we actually think star voting is better, but you know, ranked choice voting has more air quotes momentum," which I would argue with that, but that's their sense that ranked choice voting has more momentum. And a lot of times there's a lot of money behind the ranked choice voting movement,
yeah,
and so there's an incentive to advocate for that over other methods. But for me, I'd rather advocate for a voting method that actually does the thing that it says that it does, even if it means we don't have a bunch of money pouring in to help us with that effort. We just have our enthusiasm.
yeah. So how many? Yeah. So how many people are working for your organization right now?
So there's two actual employees at Equal Vote, and then we're also hiring canvassers to collect signatures. So
Okay.
it's a very small organization. I'm doing it on a volunteer basis. We're very, very much supported by our volunteers who are amazing. And yeah, like I said, enthusiasm. That's kind of the main thing pushing us forward.
Well, hopefully yes, and hopefully this will work out for you. I like what I'm seeing of this system.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the enthusiasm will take you a long way, and hopefully will attract those
Yeah,
good donors in the future.
yeah. Do you have anything to say before we go?
I think the main thing is just to encourage people, if they want to try it out themselves, go to star.vote, make a simple poll, vote on favorite superhero or something, If you want to learn more, you can go to starvoting.org or you can go to equal.vote.
Okay, well, thank you, Annie Kallen. I'm Chris Baker. Look at my Substack, Fountainhead Forum, substack.com. Look at my novel, Escape from the Village, at escapevillage.com. And yeah, so like, subscribe, and watch this video and share it. And we are out.